Now that you have a good overall picture of how AppSuite works, let's dive into some of the nitty-gritty details, how it actually renders Liquid and how plugins fit into the mix. Let's start out with a sample template and walk through the rendering pipeline as it processes the template. This template starts out with a style tag, and then it has an h1 tag underneath it. The style tag has some really basic CSS inside it, and intermingled we also have a style liquid tag. Inside the style liquid tag, we effectively have a tag name, which is style. Then we have a few tag parameters, which are background color followed by my favorite color. So let's see how AppSuite renders this sample template to a business user. When a user edits the content of a template or edits a page, they see the screen that you see on the right-hand side here. The bulk of the user interface is used to show a preview of the template. On the right-hand sidebar, we have a list of properties that the template exposes. This is where each of the styles are made accessible to the user so they can tweak it. In our case, since we only have one style tag, we only see one row under the appearance settings. That row has a nice little color palette that lets users select which color to apply to this particular style. Now on the left-hand side, you can see that the h1 tag is in fact styled with the green that we selected. Let's take a quick step back and explain a pretty important delineation in AppSuite's codebase. As you work through AppSuite, you'll notice that a lot of the plugins differentiate between a business side and a consumer side. The business side is what lets users manipulate settings that the templates expose. The consumer side is what gets rendered as output for consumers. So if you look at the user interface that we just talked about, the preview is actually just an iframe to the consumer side. Everything else is rendered by the business side. Okay, now you have a pretty good idea of how the user interface looks and feels. Let's talk a little bit about the backend and how the consumer side gets rendered as far as the backend is concerned. So first, AppSuite gets an HTTP request from a browser, and it sends the request directly to the consumer controller's render page liquid action. From the render page liquid action, we fetch the page that the consumer is looking for and execute the render liquid method on the page. The render liquid method actually resides in the liquid renderable module. We extracted this render liquid method and a lot of the logic associated with it into its own module because several types of objects might need to render liquid, for example a page or a page group, and it also made testing a little bit easier. So that render liquid method does a whole lot of setup as far as gathering context, setting up variables, fetching plugins, and basically it sets up the template so that it's ready to be rendered. Once the template has all the context that it needs in order to render, the render liquid method parses the template. It does so using a built-in method from the liquid gem, liquid::template.parse. And what happens at this stage is we actually validate the liquid that's inside the template. After we've validated it and compiled it, we're ready to render it. So we call parsed template.render. We pass in the context that we set up earlier and a few registers, which are basically a different way of saying the context. And then finally, we create a new result object with the content that we rendered, as well as a few more variables. And the very last thing that the consumer controller does is call content on that object in order to render content to the consumer. In the next slide, we'll talk about how our custom liquid tags play into this rendering pipeline. In order to create a new liquid tag, you create a class that does three things. First, it inherits from liquid tag. Second, it has a render method, which takes in a context. The context effectively includes all the variables that are available to your template. And last, you register your tag in the liquid::template.registerTag method. That's where you specify what the tag's name is as far as the template is concerned, and what the class associated with that name is. Now that you have an understanding of how a tag works, here's a real implementation of a tag. In this one, you see that the initialize method does some basic validation. It makes sure that we only accept style properties that AppSuite supports. If you look up the valid styles constant, you'll see that we only support 3 style properties. The render method is noticeably smaller, but does the bulk of the work. First, it uses the context, which was passed in as the first parameter, to fetch the style model corresponding to the current style that's being rendered. This is important. Almost all of our liquid tags have corresponding models. Remember when we called the render liquid method from a few slides ago? That's when we fetch those models and store them specifically for this moment in time, the moment when we call the render method and try to actually output text for the liquid tag. So after we have the style object, we make sure that it exists, and then we call formatted value on it. And the formatted value method is an implementation detail for the style model. We won't get into that right now. Just know that the render method should always return a string. You can find all of AppSuite's tags inside the libwf liquid.rb file. Near the middle there, you'll see the style tag that we just created. But at the top, you'll see one of the more important tags, the plugin tag. This is our most versatile tag because it creates different types of plugins depending on the parameters you pass to it. Now that you know a little bit about how the template gets rendered, that is, how the consumer side gets rendered, let's talk a little bit about the business side. As far as the rendering pipeline is concerned, let's start out with the part of the business side that's closest to the rendering pipeline, that sidebar that we talked about earlier. As you see, we have two main sections, the content settings and the appearance settings. The content settings looks at plugins, settings, and widgets. It gets all of them and lists them by name alphabetically. The appearance settings only list the styles in the template. Now there's a lot of JavaScript that goes into creating that appearance settings box, but you probably won't have to look at that since it's been around for quite a while. And that's about it. There's not much to the business side rendering. Okay, the style tag implementation was really simple. Plugins, though, are a completely different beast. For starters, they're complete Rails engines. That means that they have their own models and corresponding database tables. They have their own controllers and their own views. All this means that they have a lot more dynamic content. Sometimes the dynamic content gets displayed for all the users, and sometimes the content gets displayed differently based on which channel the plugin gets rendered to. Along with that dynamicism, we also get a lot more functionality as far as the template creator is concerned. For example, the voting plugin displays different content depending on whether the user is allowed to vote, is not yet allowed to vote, or the voting deadline has passed. Alright, let's get into the structure of plugins. First of all, plugins is a loaded term. When we first created them, it was our intention to have a separate Rails engine for each plugin type. But as contractors evolved their codebase, they started putting plugins into one engine to reduce code duplication. What we're left with today is a central plugin folder where we house individual Rails engines, but each of those engines have one or more plugins. In this example, the Rails engine is Engagements, and it houses the signup form, sweeps, and UGC plugins. As we said before, the plugin has a business side and a consumer side. The business side lets users adjust template settings and page settings, while the consumer side renders plugin contents to consumers. One of the other big things you'll notice when you start working with plugins is their convoluted table names. Fortunately, the structure is pretty intuitive. So all plugin tables start out with a prefix followed by the model name. The prefix is usually the part that gets you. For example, the engagements engine that we're looking at here has a signup form. The prefix for the signup form is engagement_signup_form_. Let's look at the structure in a little bit more detail just so you get a good grasp of what we're doing here. Each plugin's main model is the app model. This is the model that associates the instance of a plugin to a page or page group. So each plugin has a variant of the pattern that you see here, the plugin name _app. In addition to this table, most plugins have their own tables that store settings, user entries, and other stuff. Those tables also follow the same pattern. For more complicated cases like the Engagements plugin, where a plugin is housed with other plugins, we have two prefixes. First, the main Rails engine in which the plugin resides, and second, the individual plugin that the table relates to. Great, now you can navigate the plugin directories without getting hopelessly lost, and you also understand how AppSuite renders them in general. Next, you'll learn about our most complicated Rails engine, the engagements engine.